Okay, this Sunday's gospel is from Luke chapter 14, verse 7 through 14. When Jesus noticed that the manner in which the guests chose the places of honor, he gave them a speech in parables, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down at the place of honor, for fear that someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host, who has invited both you, may come and say to you, 'Give this person your place,' and then you, in your disgrace, would begin when you would have to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Then he said to the one who had invited him, when he gave a luncheon or a dinner, "Do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, for fear that they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be happy because they have no means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." That is the gospel lesson. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, this is an interesting passage, the origin of which is actually somewhat modified from other experiences. In the other gospel readings, where parts of it exist pretty much as it is, Luke has modified this a little, and there are a number of different places that he probably got this from. I like the Syriac contribution. "And you should endeavor to grow from what is small and become smaller from what is great." You should grow from what is small, and you should become smaller from what is great. And you seek to grow from what is small and not be made small from what is great. Okay, that's those are from the from Syriac, Heraclean, Syriac, and Puritonian Syriac, which are biblical sources that are a little bit different. I notice looking at this that my eyes are in, got one that's kind of droopy. That's I had surgery this week on a cataract, so if that looks odd to you, it is odd to me too. Anyway, but I'm getting better. Well, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. We hear this numbers of times, but what does that really mean in our particular life? Well, I kind of like it. I have a geopolitical example of this, which is quite obvious, and somewhat to the critique of my own country, the United States. The United States before World War II, which it didn't enter until December of 1941. By that time, it had been going on for about almost 3 years. And and we came into it by a horrific insult. The only way to really organize and focus a democracy like ours is to insult us big time. And Pearl Harbor was that insult. It was the perfect insult to draw us together. Otherwise, we're off in all kinds of directions. But we were at that time sort of an untested world power. We had not really done much on the world stage. We had colonized some Spanish colonies like Cuba and the Philippines, but otherwise we had done really very little on the world stage. But everyone could see, population-wise and territorial resource-wise, we were potentially quite potent. Now, to the Japanese admiral who led the attack on Pearl Harbor indicated from the start of planning to do that this was a bad idea. And he said, basically, he thought that he had studied in the United States, and he knew something about it. And so he said, no, you don't really want to poke the bear. But they did poke the bear, and the bear woke up and got very focused, and triumphantly did a pretty major job. Now, the two rising empires at that time were the Soviet Union and the United States. The waning empire was the United Kingdom and France and many of the other European colonial powers. And World War II was kind of the sifting all that out. So, what I want to talk about is not so much the winning of World War II, which was a big feather in the cap of the United States and the Soviet Union and its allies. I just recently read a history book that indicated that had the Axis powers been rational, they would have decided not to follow this particular path into war with the Allies. The reason being is that just on the pros and cons of it, the cons far outweighed the pros, and the possibility that there would be, at least eventually, a total reversal of fortunes is exactly what happened. But that's not, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Now, in the United States, we were sort of one of the kings of the mountain, and we were in direct conflict with the Soviet Union. But both of us went at this in a different way. The Soviets had lost perhaps 25 million people, civilians and military. They lost 5 million military in Stalingrad itself, in the Battle of Stalingrad, which was a turning point for the Soviet Union's war against Germany. So they were gun shy of getting into a conflict with the United States, especially since we had already used nuclear weapons, or atomic weapons anyway. And we had nuclear weapons, and eventually the plans for our nuclear weapons were surreptitiously given to the Soviets. So they put their money into that experience, and so they became a nuclear power as well. And so the two powers did not really want to get into direct competition. Now, the exceptions to that would have been the Cuban Missile Crisis. But basically, the Soviet strategy from World War II on was to stay out of a destructive war with the United States. And they did that by setting pretty secure boundaries as how far they would go in a particular conflict. In Vietnam, they threw all kinds of material against us, just to keep us pinned down and using our resources. And they managed in that particular time to avoid those kinds of things. Eventually they got into Afghanistan, and it turned out to be a huge loser for them. But like Vietnam, was relatively small war. And the point I'm trying to make is the first shall be last and the last shall be first. It seemed to me that in the United States we spent most of our time in the Cold War trying to be first. And it seemed to me that the Soviets, while definitely pushing up against us, were not as interested in being first. They were interested in specifically keeping themselves out of war with the United States, so that they would not lose any more people, as they did in what they call the Great Patriotic War, World War II. And as far as it went, they accomplished their mission, because the two superpowers did not. They had many small brush fire wars that we combated each other. But in general, their strategy to keep us from going head to head with each other was successful. And ours was more of a rational strategy, but it wasn't particularly as specifically rational. They had a whole strategic planning. The Soviets had a strategic planning that looked at the strategic situation and did what it could to keep the Soviet Union out of direct conflict with the United States. The United States probably had some military committees that were doing something of the same thing for the United States, keeping us out of direct conflict, thinking about the consequences of smaller incursions and brush wars. It was a bipolar world. It is no longer. But the last shall be first and the first shall be last. The last in this case was the Soviet Union. And they managed to keep themselves out of a direct war with the United States. The United States pretty much avoided that too, although the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Soviet provocation to by putting missiles into Cuba 90 miles off the coast of Florida, one of the stupider moves that was not in their strategic interest. But they did get something out of it, which was not immediately visible. They got us to not give missiles to Turkey at the time. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. The Soviet Union, which is the last place I would have ever wanted to live, which completely avoided the idea of a consumer economy in order to build up their military forces, and that's what they did. They built up their military forces, but they also built up their space-oriented forces as well, and they had a strong space program, which resulted in the Soyuz program and eventually the space station, which eventually became the International Space Station as the Soviets disintegrated. We were lucky with Mikhail Gorbachev that we didn't get ourselves into a real conflict. When empires tend to collapse, they can thrash around quite miserably, but Gorbachev didn't do that, thank goodness. Now, a lot of people give Ronald Reagan credit, but the credit for the Soviet Union going down goes to the Cold War itself, the American resistance to the Soviet power from really the late 1940s on until the 90s or the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president. The American economic power won. I thought Mr. Reagan made some really nice moves and eventually met with Mr. Gorbachev, and so that was all helpful. But he did not win this Cold War. He simply ended it. The Cold War was a standoff that went on for at least 40 years, almost 50. But the last shall be first and the first shall be last. That Soviet strategy to keep from having a direct conflict with the United States, because they knew that they would that both countries would be in terrible shape after it. And they had lost 25 million or more people during World War II, so they knew the cost directly, as we did not. The United States lost 600,000 military troops and almost no civilians in the Second World War. The two oceans did well by us, as usual, in our geographic isolation. The Soviets were not isolated. They are part of Europe and Asia. And and they were soundly thrashed for the first couple of years of war with Germans. But they eventually turned that around. They progressed both strategically and tactically. At first, the only thing they had to offer was bodies, and they threw them in willy-nilly. That's why it's called the Great Patriotic War, because a lot of people lost their lives, at least in the initial couple of years that the Soviets were fighting off the Germans. They did manage to keep them from taking over Moscow, which is about all they managed. But then when they began to counterattack and they began to push the Germans out, they did a really good job of it. The last will be first, and the first will be last. The Soviets did not have the economic structure to be able to really be in full competition with the United States. They didn't. We had a full-blown consumer economy that drained off enough so that we had the preeminent military. And our military spending was like 10 times the next actor. Most of Europe didn't have to spend money on defense very much because we were the ones who provided the defense, and to a certain extent still do. Well, that's what I'm thinking about this week.